All right. Hello, class. Psychology 135. This is Chapter 5, Lecture number 2. And first, I thought I'd back up a little bit. A little discussion of the Collins and Quillian study. The idea that we have facts and categories organized in our mind. And in particular, they had the idea that it would be very efficient information storage wise to think about where you store certain kinds of information. So here I found an example of a propositional network. So we can see at the top here, you have living thing, and it has the properties that it can grow, that it's living. I would also put on here, these kinds of things. And then animal can move, it has skin, etc. And then you have things like bird. Bird is a, see this is a right here? This is an is a link. Bird is an animal. And the things you know about birds is that they fly, they have feathers, they have wings. Likewise, here's another link off of animal. There's fish. Fish are animals. They have scales, they can swim, they have gills. And then you have subtypes like salmon is a fish and it's red. And you might have other information associated with salmon, like they swim upriver to spawn, they come from Alaska, these kinds of things. Sunfish are yellow. And so it would be an efficient idea, an efficient way to store information, according to Collins and Quillian, um, if you kept the essential information closest to the node that it represented, and any information that applied to many things, like all plants have roots. So it makes sense for me to store the idea of roots one time at the node for plant, rather than also at tree and also at flower and also at rose and also at daisy, if that makes sense. So it would be efficient to just store the idea of roots at the higher order concept of plant rather than rather than storing it many times at all the different kinds of plants. Okay, so that is just a proposal about a reasonable and efficient way to store this kind of information. And they wanted to find some experimental evidence of this proposal. So what they did was they asked people to verify facts. So for instance, they would say, is a canary yellow? Um, is a rose red? Or can a rose be red? Is an oak tall? Is a salmon red? These kinds of questions. Or they would ask, is a salmon living? Okay, or is a salmon, does a salmon have skin? And when people had to verify a fact that they hypothesized logically should be stored at a higher level of the hierarchy, it took people longer to verify those facts than it did for people to verify facts that were closer in the hierarchy. So this is what Collins and Quillian called the semantic distance effect. And it's really kind of a remarkable finding that reveals something about the structure of our knowledge representations, that we seem to have this hierarchy and we have this efficient storage of information at different levels of the hierarchy. You store information at the level where it has the most impact, where it applies the most broadly. So hopefully that makes sense. And if it doesn't, we can talk about it on Tuesday to make sure everybody understands. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about schemas. And schemas are a particular form of also an organized mental representation. So the idea of a schema is that your brain has something like a database of knowledge. And importantly, this database has assumptions built into it, has pre-filled in ideas about things. So one way to say is you have slots and default values. So maybe an analogy would be to a certain kind of database like an address book on your phone. You have a contact program on your phone that stores all your friends' names, first name, last name, phone number. They might have a home phone, work phone, mobile phone. You might have an entry for email address. You might have an entry for a physical address. You might have a home address and a work address. And each of those home and work addresses has certain slots. It has, street address, city, state, zip code, country. So that's what we mean by slots. That when you learn about something, hey, I just signed up for a new class. Okay, you tell me that you signed up for a new class. My brain calls up a record, says, okay, I'm going to create a new entry about class that my friend has enrolled in. And there's going to be automatic slots. Like, I imagine this class is probably my first assumption is that it's taught in a classroom by a professor. If this is a friend from San Jose State, you may fill in the default assumption this is a class at San Jose State. If your friend is a psychology major, you may fill in the default assumption this is probably a psychology class. And you do all this unconsciously. It's like you're entering a new record into your knowledge base, and your brain goes ahead and fills in some of that information, helps you out. It's as if you just met a friend and they're local and they say, hey, what's your phone number? And you go ahead and assume it's probably going to start with 408 or 669. Those are the area codes in this area. And so you're going to assume that's probably what your phone number is. So you see your friend and their friend says, oh, I'm taking a new class. It's awesome. And you've already made a lot of assumptions. You're thinking, okay, it's probably a San Jose State class. You probably sit down, you're in a classroom, there's desks, there's a professor. And you say, oh, what class is it? Okay, wow, all right. Now I need to update my database. Okay, we're not in a classroom, we're in a dojo, right? We're not sitting in desks, wearing gis. We're gonna have belts. And we're probably barefoot. So all of a sudden you need to update. But the point is that we have these schemas. We have these, our knowledge about the world is structured. It has certain slots. It has certain default values. And we automatically fill in with reasonable guesses about what should go into those slots as much as we can. And I would like to note, this is really important that we do this. It enables efficient communication. It enables us to live our lives in a quick and efficient manner. It would be very strange and very difficult to not have schemas and not have things filled in. It would be like, your friend tells you, hey, I just bought a new house. And you say, oh, cool. Does it come with a roof? Did you put a door in? Does it have windows? I heard windows are good, so you can look outside. Uh, you know, um, you don't want to ask all these questions. When somebody tells you they bought a house, well, in this area, you think, where'd you get the money to be able to afford a house in San Jose? Um, but you have automatic assumptions. You assume it's got four walls, it's got a roof. You may even auto-populate your mental imagery with a certain view of a house, right? And a question we're going to ask later is, what kind of image of a house comes up? Is it something like the average house? Is it a specific house that maybe you've seen recently? Is it, what kind of information is sort of auto-populated? But for now, I want you to get the idea of schemas. That schemas are knowledge representations in your semantic network that have kind of slots or places to put information. And more importantly, they have default values that are auto-filled into those slots. And this is important because it enables communication. It enables you to act. You understand what you're supposed to do, and you have a sort of shared knowledge that you don't have to ask a lot of questions. Instead, you're able to just carry on with the conversation. Oh, cool, you have a karate class. Do you like it? What are you doing? You can get more information. So let's tell you a little bit about some of the kind of classic research on schemas. And one of them is a study done by Brewer and Trans in 1981. This is a pretty famous study. And what they showed was that people's schemas have an influence on what they remember from certain events. And let me show you what their study was like, first of all. So then we'll talk about the Bartlett study and the War of the Ghosts. So first, the Brewer and Tran study, the way it worked was participants would sign up for an experiment, kind of like you sign up in Sona to go participate in an experiment. And they'd show up to the experiment, and one of the experimenters would meet them and say, okay, we just need to get some things ready. Come on in here and have a seat. And they would make people sit in this white chair here on the right in this office. And so take a look here at this office and pretend you are a participant. So you'd sit down, just hanging out in the office, waiting for the experiment to start. And they would leave you there for, I think it's like 45 seconds, something like that. And that's about how long we've had this picture up. So I'll go back. And now I want you to think, well, basically what would happen to the participant is the experimenter would come and pick them up, they'd take them into another room, and they'd say, okay, what I'd like you to do for this experiment is I want you to write down every single thing you can remember from the office you were just sitting in. And just here's a piece of paper, write it all down. And so people would write down all the stuff they saw in the office. And you might want to do this right now. You could pause the video and you just had to look at that picture. So try to remember all the stuff that was in that office. So what would happen is people would write down things. They would write down that they saw books, they saw bookshelves, they saw a desk. This is in the days before computers. They might report they saw a typewriter. Some people would notice that there was a skull on the shelf, which is a little odd. They might notice that there was a bulletin board. And so, people would go along and they would write down all these things that they saw in the office. Well, let's go back and look at this picture. Here's the interesting thing. There are no books in this picture. If you look carefully, there's a stack of papers on the bookshelf. There's a globe. There's a bottle of wine, a skull. There are no books on the bookshelf. There's a typewriter. There's coffee maker and a bulletin board. And what Brewer and Trans found out from their study was that people tended to falsely remember certain items being in the office that weren't actually in the office, things like books. And also, they were not very good at remembering items that were not common for an office. So, for instance, a bottle of wine, the picnic basket, and the skull. Even though those things are a little odd, especially something like the skull, you might think, wow, that's just very interesting and unexpected in an office. So you might expect for there to be a surprise effect that if something doesn't match your schema for an office, that it would kind of stick out and seem unusual and it would be therefore more memorable. But in fact, the exact opposite happens. When there are items in the office or things that occur in real life that don't match your schema, sometimes you remember them, but most often you're actually worse at remembering those things that do not match your schema, and you're better at remembering the things that do match your schema. So we seem to have this kind of bias in our long-term memory, where long-term memory is better for things that fit with our existing schemas, and it's not as good for things that don't fit our schemas. And there's some really interesting real-world consequences to this bias in terms of our ability to remember information. I'll give you one example. We live in a time right now when society seems to be pretty bifurcated in terms of our political views. It seems that there are people on the left and there are people on the right, and the distribution of political discourse is pretty bimodal. People seem to have their opinions and they have their positions on certain topics, and they don't like to deviate from those. So, a really interesting study is one where, I'm sorry, I forget the authors who did this, but they took people and they divided them, or I recruited people who felt strongly about the Second Amendment, who felt strongly about gun rights. And they found people who are both for gun control and people who are against gun control, right? Or if you want to frame it, pro-gun rights or anti-gun rights. This is sort of a valence term, right? Gun control is the kind of preferred term for people probably on the left, and gun rights is the preferred term for people on the right. But anyway, they found people who are on both sides of the Second Amendment issue, and they had them read an essay. And this essay presented a number of arguments. It presented the same number of arguments in favor of gun control as it did the same number of arguments for gun rights. Okay, so you have, like, say, 6 reasons why we should have gun control and 6 reasons why we should have gun rights. And they had people read those articles, and then they asked them to recall as many of the facts and the reasons that were presented as they could. And what they found was people tended to be better at remembering the arguments that matched the position they already held. So people who were in favor of more gun control remembered more of the arguments for gun control than they did for remembering the arguments against gun control. And the people who were for gun rights remembered more arguments for gun rights than they remembered against gun rights or for gun control. So this shows you that if you already have an existing opinion, for some reason, the human mind is designed that we're better at remembering information that's consistent with our opinions and that matches our existing schemas than we are at remembering information that is a violation of our existing opinions or schemas. And this really influences even the kind of information. When everybody reads the same set of facts and arguments for and against a position, they tend to remember the facts that are in favor of their own position, and they don't remember as well the facts that are against their position. So this is just one of a number of ways that our schemas, our default knowledge structures, change the way that we remember things in the world. And the term schema comes from a fellow named Bartlett in 1932, and he did a study with a Native American tale called The War of the Ghosts. And this is a short story, and it's from the Native American tradition. And so it's, from a Western perspective, it's a little bit hard to follow this story. It has some events and things that don't really make sense to us. Characters in the story come to conclusions, and you're kind of like, why did they come to that conclusion? But if you were from the Native American tradition, from whatever tribe this story was from, it would have made perfect sense. There's all kinds of background information and knowledge. There's all kinds of schemas that would exist in that culture that allowed the story to make sense to them. But to people who are not from that culture, the story was a little hard to remember. And so what Bartlett showed was that if you asked people he had everybody read this story, and then he would bring them back and try to see how much of the story they remembered. And what he found was that people made very systematic errors in terms of what they ended up remembering from the story. So for instance, they would omit information that maybe didn't make sense to them. or maybe that was unpleasant. At the beginning of the story, there's a couple of braves, and they're going down to the river to hunt seals. And so, oh, baby seals, we don't want to think about them being hunted, so maybe I just kind of omit that from my recounting of the story. People add rationalizations into their retelling of the story that weren't really there. They introduce some theme to the story that wasn't necessarily present in the original. Um, they transform the information, they get kind of the sequence wrong, or they change who did what. And the other thing Bartlett found, and remember, this is 1932, so we're still struggling with racist attitudes today. But imagine what it was like in the 1930s, especially towards Native Americans. Um, People, how they had, what their attitude was about Native Americans really influenced their memory of the story and tended to really color that story. So we've got a couple of really interesting things going on when you're thinking about schemas interacting with long-term memory. You tend to encode information that fits your schemas better than you encode information that does not fit your schemas in the first place. And then when it comes time for retrieval, you tend to also, again, remember information better that fits the schemas you already have. And if there's information that sort of doesn't fit it, you might transform it or omit or rationalize or do one of these things when you're remembering or recounting a story in such a way that now you've changed things a little bit and you're telling a slightly different story, sort of through your own lens of the world. You're subconsciously changing what you say and what you remember to fit your existing schemas. And this is going to have all kinds of consequences for things like, for instance, eyewitness memory for crimes and other police events. If we want to interview eyewitnesses, ideally you have 4 different people who saw the same, say, bank robbery. You're going to get 4 different stories. They're not going to be exactly the same. And so part of the reason people have these different stories is that they have different schemas that they're operating from. And so they're going to they're going to selectively remember things differently. When the information decays in memory, some things are going to decay more than others. They're going to introduce these rationalizations and omissions and all that kind of stuff. So this has a lot of real world consequences. And we'll be talking about this topic again when we get to the chapter on long-term memory, chapters 6 and 7, which are the next 2 chapters. Okay, so I've introduced the idea of schemas, that we have existing knowledge that we bring to bear in our interpretation of the world, that when we hear about something, that we automatically sort of call up a memory or a knowledge structure that has slots and default values that allow us to anticipate and make sense of the world. And this is a good thing because it helps us navigate the world, but it also could have a dark side because it can affect your memory for things. And it can cause you, for instance, in the example of stereotypes, to make automatic assumptions about people based on some physical appearance. So here's some different examples of schemas and ways that schemas influence our thinking. One example is stereotypes. So if you see somebody and based on some external characteristic like the color of their skin or the way they dress, which may give you information about maybe, for instance, what religion they belong to or they practice, that may automatically fill in information for you that is, probably incorrect in some ways, but maybe have some truth to it. But you're going to make automatic assumptions about people. That's the idea of stereotyping. And these automatic assumptions are sort of built into the way we look at the world. And they, for better or worse. So I'll give you an example of a stereotype. let's talk about the stereotype of the absent-minded professor. So when I first became a professor, I discovered that I had this stereotype that went along with the job title of being professor, which is, absent-minded professor, kind of head in the clouds, not aware of the world. And I have to admit that there were a few times, especially at the beginning, when I would sort of use that stereotype to deflect blame for certain things. So let's imagine I forgot to respond to an email to a student or something like that. I say, hey, professor, did you get my email? And I say, oh, sorry, I'm so busy, absent-minded professor, kind of, sorry, forgive me. And people were like, oh, that's just professors, oh, they've got so much going on. They're thinking about, I don't know, deep thoughts about the universe or something, and sometimes they don't, their head's not in the present moment. They're not really used to things. So I've definitely relied on the stereotype of being an absent-minded professor to try to deflect blame from having forgotten to do certain things. So that's an example of stereotypes. Of course, we have much kind of other more serious forms of stereotypes. Um, and a lot of what happens with the stereotypes is, especially things surrounding race, culture, religion, um, a lot of this is kind of like, well, how do we get the information that we automatically fill? So you have these slots in default values. Where does this default value information come from? And it seems that a lot of this default value information comes from the media. And it comes from the sorts of images and characterizations of people that we see in the media. And of course, now where do those characterizations come from? They come from existing cultural stereotypes. So we have a little bit of a sort of self-referential situation going on here. But a lot of your default assumptions about classes of people that you don't know very well tend to come from the media. And this is why, for instance, one of the greatest ways to overcome stereotypes is to meet people from groups that you may not know about. If you actually don't know anybody from a particular group, then you can't really think of anything besides the presentation or characterization of that people from the media. So that's one example of schemas. So a stereotype is a schema about people or a class of people based on some external appearance or some superficial knowledge you have about them, like they have a profession, they have a job as a professor. Okay, next, social roles. So this is another example of schemas and kind of related to stereotypes, but think about somebody who is a firefighter or a police officer. When they put on that uniform, they become that social role. They are a firefighter and they will behave differently than other people. So, there's a burning building, they're going to run into the burning building instead of running away from the burning building. And they take on you may take on a certain demeanor when you think about yourself in a certain social role. Um, let's see. Here's another example of a social role. It's kind of a stereotype. So sometimes people will take on the social role or the stereotype of the angry customer. So I'm the customer. You screwed up my order. I should get this for free, or you need to give me a discount because I'm angry and the customer's always right. And in the United States, at least in American culture, we have this thing where, okay, please the customer, give them whatever they want. It's important to keep their business. Lots of other countries are like, whatever, don't come back then. They just don't have that sort of thing. So you can play up a certain kind of role that somebody may have. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about scripts. So the next one to talk about are scripts. And scripts are schemas that play out over time. And in fact, I think I have, let's see. Oh, I forgot to talk about that one. Let's see. Let's look at, I think I have scripts here. Yeah, let's talk about scripts for a second, then I'll come back and tell you about those other things. Um, so a script is a schema having to do with a certain kind of order of events, of an expectation of how things go. So for instance, you probably have a script for how to go into a coffee shop and buy a cup of coffee. You know that you walk in, you stand in line, you get up to the counter. They say, you know, like, let's take Starbucks or Pete's or something. Okay, what is it that what is it that you want? They say, oh, I want a, you know, extra tall latte, no foam, double whip, you know, I don't know, so whatever your drink is that you order. And so, okay, you pay for your drink, and then you kind of slide over and you wait for the barista to make your drink, and they ask your name, and they put your name on the cup, and then when your drink's ready, they call out your name, and you pick it up and you go. Another example is going to a restaurant. So if you think about it, you know, a lot of times if we were in person in class, I would ask you folks to say, all right, what do you do when you go to a restaurant? In what order? What happens first? And people will be really good at saying what happens. You know, you come to the restaurant. If it's a busy night, you talk to a host and you say, you know, do you have any availability? They'll say yes, but maybe it's going to be a 10-minute wait. So maybe you have to just kind of sit there. Sometimes they give you a pager so you can sort of walk around and then they buzz you when your table's ready. You come in, they seat you. Um, they might give you water right away, give you some menus. Then that person who seats you is not your server. That is just the host. And so you don't really want to order things from that person. So you sit there, you wait, then the host comes over and they say, you know, can we take your drink order? Would you like appetizers? And then you say something like, oh, sorry, we've been talking. We haven't even had a chance to look at the menu. So, okay, I'll come back in a minute. Then they come back, and then maybe you order some drinks, you order some appetizers, and then they bring those out, and then they take your entree order, and then you give that, and then you know they bring out the food, and then there's even like little subscripts that you can deviate. So, um, for instance, you know, oh, this steak is undercooked, send it back to the kitchen, you know, and there's a little subroutine that you might go into if you're dissatisfied with your food and you have a certain way that you know you're supposed to act. So then you get through the main part of the meal. Then the waiter or waitress comes over and they say, here's a dessert menu. Can I interest you in a dessert? Did you save room for dessert? And sometimes you say, oh, no, I couldn't possibly. I'm full. Or sometimes you say, sure, you know, let's get the chocolate cake. Then you pay. And there may be a little song and dance that goes along with paying. So depending on who you're with, um, so for instance, the script might be if you're going out to dinner with your parents pick up the check. If you and friends are going out to dinner, you might grab the check and they say, oh, no, 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 I'm going to get this one. No, you got the last one. And you know, you have to fight. And even if you don't really want to pay for it, you're going to pretend like you're at least ready to pay for it and see if the other person will pay for it, and on and on. So there's a whole script of going to a restaurant. And we aren't even usually consciously aware of having all of this script until you go to another country. So if you go to another country, they may have completely different rules and expectations about how this thing is going to go. I can tell you a quick story of my brother and I backpacking through Europe in the this was years ago. It's like 1999 or 2000. And we were young, stupid Americans backpacking through Europe, and we got to Italy, and it was summer, and it was hot, and it was the end of the tourist season. And um, I think all of all of the merchants and restaurants were just sick of tourists, and sick of Americans in particular. And so my brother and I sat down. We went to this Italian restaurant, and we did the most, stereotypical American ignorant thing you could do. We ordered pizza uh, at the Italian restaurant. And first example of a schema is we assume, being Americans, if you order a pizza has cheese on it, right? So my brother and I each ordered a pizza, and mine came and it had cheese on it, and my brother's came, no cheese, just like sauce and mushrooms. And so my brother's kind of going, huh? He says, well, I think I think I want to get some cheese. Do you think it would be okay if I asked for some Parmesan? And just based on how the waiters had been sort of treating us and the attitude they had, I said, I don't think you should ask. I think we should just eat our pizza and go. And my brother says, well, I already ate like, a couple pieces of the pizza. Clearly I like it. So I think it's probably okay if I ask for some Parmesan. I'm not going to offend them. So he calls the waiter over and he says, could I please have some Parmesan for my pizza? And the waiter looks at it and says, Parmesan's not for pizza. Mozzarella, maybe. And then he walks away and just like, no, you can't have you can't have Parmesan. That's not even appropriate for that kind of food. Sorry. He didn't even say sorry. He just said, no, mozzarella, maybe, and walked away. And we were just totally dumbfounded because this is not how things are done in America. I mean, we have this attitude the customer's always right. So if you have a bowl of cornflakes and you call the waiter over, it's like, could I please have some French mustard for my cornflakes? They'd be like, okay, I don't know why you want that, but here's some mustard. It's like, whatever, knock yourself out. In Italy, it was a very different attitude. It was sort of like, no, the food's the food. We presented you the way it should be presented. Don't mess with my recipe. That's not up to you. Um, so, and another example is you're at work and they bring out the happy birthday cake, and you are going to talk about, everybody gathers around, they have the person, and then they sing that song, like, happy birthday. And it just drags on. I hate that birthday dirge of a song. Another example of classroom lectures. We have a certain expectation about how it goes. You guys are sitting down. I come in. I say, "Hello, everybody. How are you?" And we have some chatter. Then time comes up, and we start, and we launch in. And anyway, we have lots of scripts that we expect. So let me give you some other examples of schemas. So another let's see, another sort of schema is the idea of like a worldview. So these are things like how you think about the world. So if you said a phrase like life is blank, so like life is a battle, everything's a struggle. You have to fight for what you want. Or maybe you have a worldview like life is like a garden. Relationships are cultivated like flowers or vegetables. You have to tend to them, you have to care for them, give them constant attention. Life is like a building. You must start with a solid foundation. Life is like a roller coaster. It's got ups and downs, and we're all just along for the ride, and etc. So these are examples of, kind of ways that you might look at the world, right? So you probably know certain people who look at the world in a certain way, and if you look at the world like the world's a roller coaster, I'm just along for the ride. It's got ups and downs. That may have consequences for your behavior. That might shape how you behave. You may be less active in your role in life, right? You may just if you look at the world like, well, the world happens to me, I don't really control the world. It's just sort of full of random events. Then that sort of lowers your self-efficacy, your feeling of self-empowerment. So there may be certain consequences to having these different worldviews. Um, Archetypes and plot devices. So let me show you some of these other things here. So this I came across recently, well, maybe a couple of years ago now. There's a movie by Simon Pegg called World's End. And in this movie, he goes down to his hometown and he meets up with some buddies, and they're going to do a pub crawl where they go from pub to pub to pub over the course of an evening. And so he was working out the plot for World's End. And I saw this picture of it somewhere online, and I grabbed it because I thought it's really interesting example of storytelling. So if you see here at the top, it says part one, state the hero's problem. Hero is offered a chance to change and refuses. So prologue, story of the night, magic night. They meet young Gary and the gang, and then they go into the present, and Gary's in therapy. Okay, so then part two, scenes 14 to 26. Hero deals with old world in a new light. So he teams up with an ally, and the door opens to the new world. So these are very kind of interesting behind the scenes plot points and beats that a script writer in Hollywood is going to be trying to communicate. We have lots of schemas about stories and the kinds of stories we tell each other in entertainment. The very fact that I can say something like, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy fights to get girl back, the end, right? That's how many plots have been like that. Um, Dozens and dozens, at least. So there are certain kind of plot devices. And actually, really interesting fellow was a guy named Joseph Campbell, who is a synthetic anthropologist. So rather than looking at how stories differed across cultures, like tribe A has a certain story, and then tribe B nearby has almost the same story, but they had the following changes. Instead of focusing on how myths from different cultures were different, he instead focused on what he called the monomyth, or how stories from different cultures are kind of the same and have the same, they tend to have recurring elements. And what you find in myths from multiple cultures across the world, lots of different traditions and times, from the Iliad and the Odyssey up to Greek myths and Roman myths, to tales in medieval Europe, and even into um, movies, are this kind of common sets of events that seem to happen in the stories that we tell to each other. And typically they involve a hero. And in fact, Joseph Campbell has a great book called Hero with a Thousand Faces, which tells, kind of lays out this sort of similarities in myths across different cultures. And usually a hero story has to do with what the hero gets in the end is usually self-knowledge, and a different view of themselves in the world, and some sort of their power or an ability comes from self-discovery. And it typically involves some action of the hero being at the start of the journey, is in their home, village, or wherever. They receive a call to adventure. They go out, maybe they initially refuse the call and then they eventually accept it, and then they go out to adventure and then they come back. So Joseph Campbell identified all these myths and these stages in the hero's journey. And I think this is just an excellent example of the use of schemas, that we all across cultures have these kind of expectations about the sorts of events that happen to heroes within a story. So let's use Star Wars as an example. We're going to I'll cycle through this hero's journey with regard to Luke Skywalker and the Star Wars mythology. And actually, George Lucas was very much attuned to Joseph Campbell's theories when he wrote the script for Star Wars. So first of all, call to adventure. Luke Skywalker is on Tatooine, and he receives R2-D2 and C-3PO from the Jawas. And while he's cleaning R2-D2, a hologram of Princess Leia comes up, and she says, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope." So that leads him to go off and go find Ben Kenobi. Ben Kenobi is like a mystical hero, mystical kind of aid, a mystical kind of mentor. And he says, we really got to go help the princess. We got to leave, and we're going to leave Tatooine. And Luke says, I can't do that. I was going to go to Tashi Station and work on the power converters. And I got to work on the water condensers and things like this. And so there's initial refusal of the call. He doesn't want to go with Ben Kenobi. There's some supernatural aid. So Ben Kenobi gives him a lightsaber, which is a boon. This is a magical item. Or it may be the invisibility cloak that Harry Potter gets, or any number of other things that are given as a supernatural aid. Luke goes back. His aunt and uncle have been killed. The stormtroopers are looking for him. So he goes with Ben Kenobi. They cross the first threshold, which is that they go into space with Han Solo. They hire Han Solo. They go into space. That's crossing of the threshold, leaving of Tatooine. Then there's a period where they're in the belly of the whale. So very literally, the Star Destroyer captures the Millennium Falcon in a tractor beam. It sucks it up into the Star Destroyer. They really are very literally going into the belly of the whale, where the Star Destroyer is the whale. There's the Road of Trials, where they have to rescue a princess, literally. Uh, and Ben Kenobi has to go face his former student, Darth Vader. Um, there's kind of um, temptation, to the dark side. There's ultimate boon, which is not just the lightsaber. There is the use of the Force, which is ultimately what it's about. There's magical flight, so they're finally going. Then they're going to go attack the Death Star. So there's refusal of the return. So basically, Luke is refusing to use the Force. Then there's a magical flight. They're going down the alley of the Death Star. Then there's rescue from without. So Luke's about to get shot down by Darth Vader, but then Han Solo comes back with the Millennium Falcon and shoots Darth Vader, and that frees the way for Luke to finally accept the use of the Force, where he crosses the threshold, and now he's the master of two worlds, because he's got the regular world, and now he has accepted the world of the Force. And he hears Ben Kenobi's voice tell him, "Let go, trust your instincts." He turns off his targeting computer. He shoots the things. They go in there, go in the vent, and that destroys the Death Star. And so now Luke's the hero, and he has freedom to live because now he has accepted the Force, which is a form of self-knowledge and discovery, which leads to this larger magical boon. Anyway, um, you could do this following thing with the Iliad, the Odyssey, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. I mean, any of these kind of stories have a very particular set of stages, and maybe it's not every single one of these 17 stages, but you're going to see a bunch of these stages in almost any story. So this is not stuff from your book, but this is just my interpretation of where I'm seeing things like schemas show up in our everyday lives. Carl Jung talked about archetypes, and in fact, you can see a lot of these sort of archetypes in different different stories or in your life. So there's people who may be, the creator, they may be the explorer, the outlaw, and there's different theories. You may have different archetypes like the father, the mother, the son, the daughter. You might think of yourself very differently, and it might activate different kinds of scripts and social behaviors when you're thinking about yourself as a sibling, as opposed to a student, or when you think of yourself as a son or a daughter, as opposed to a friend or acquaintance, right? Like different, when you put yourself in sort of different hats, different mindsets, that engages different behaviors. Jungian archetypes show up in all kinds of movies. So there's archetypes like the hero. So for Harry Potter, that's clearly Harry. There's the sidekick, which is Ron and Hermione. The maiden is Ginny. The wise old man is Dumbledore. It's kind of interesting that they all have all these long white beards. You've got Dumbledore, Gandalf, and Obi-Wan Kenobi all having kind of white beards. The nurturing mother is McGonagall. The eternal child might be Hagrid. Or in Star Wars, it's C-3PO and R2-D2. You've got the villain, the shapeshifter. You don't know whether they're good or bad. So that's Snape, who's both good and bad. Gollum is both good and bad. Lando is both good and bad, right? Because he betrayed them initially in Empire. You have the trickster, which Han Solo is a great example of a trickster. Merry and Pippin from Lord of the Rings, and the Weasley twins are definitely tricksters from Harry Potter. So anyway, hopefully you get the idea. We talked about scripts, and here, this is just kind of funny. Like, here's an example of a script. So is it time to get up? Well, is your alarm sounding? No. Well, then just keep going to sleep. And then are your eyes open? Yes or no? Okay. Then you reset the alarm. Okay. All right. Is it Saturday? No. Oh, crap. Okay. Do you have an exam today? Yes. Do you have at least 30 minutes to get ready? So no, then get up. Do you have an exam today? No. Do you have a period to spare? No. So I don't know. This is just kind of a funny thing I ran across. So the last thing we're going to talk about is referring back to this idea that when you are using your schemas, you're kind of have these default values, you have these default things that you bring to mind. And um, the question is, what are you filling when you have like a default assumption about something? What is the nature of that default assumption? Is it an abstraction, which is maybe you could think of it like an average or something? Or is it a bunch of instances? So, for instance, let me ask you a question. Um, Let me tell you, imagine an apple, okay? Now, if you think about an apple, do you think of your mental image of an apple? Is it some abstract kind of Plato would say a Platonic ideal of an apple? In other words, is it not a particular apple, but something like an amalgamation of all the apples you've encountered? Or when you think of an apple, did you come up with a series of images, a bunch of apples that you've seen recently? And scientists have argued about whether our ideal kind of prototypes that we have in our mind, are they abstractions or are they a bunch of instances? And truthfully, we probably have both. I'll give you an example, which is I was just thinking of an apple, and it was just an image of a green apple. And that may not necessarily be the prototypical apple that everybody would think about, because I think a lot of people would think about apples being red. But it just so happens that I like Granny Smith apples and have been buying a lot of Granny Smith apples lately. So I was thinking of sort of an average apple, but it was influenced by the fact that I've been buying a lot of green apples for the last, couple of years. So that's probably why a green apple came to my mind first and not a red apple. But the truth is, we probably have both representations. But let me tell you, oh, okay, in a few minutes, I'm going to tell you about some evidence for abstract categories that I think is just super cool. So let's talk a little bit about where some of these things happen in the brain. Um, we know some of this information based on pretty much people who've had some kind of brain damage, and they lose the ability to remember certain kinds of objects or to recognize certain objects. Um, and this is just fascinating work. Um, so the way this goes is there's different patients who've had some sort of brain damage. And what you do is you tell them the name of an object and ask them to define it or to tell you what it is. So some people who've had damage to the temporal lobe will lose the ability to name biological categories. So you say something like a pig, and they're like, I don't know, or horse, big, and then you say cat, and they go, I don't know. Then you say hammer, and you say, oh, you grab it with your hand, you use it to drive in nails. Screwdriver, you use it to twist in screws. Um, Typewriter, you use it to type up letters and documents and forms. So, in other words, somebody who has damage to the temporal lobe may lose the ability to give you information about biological categories, like defining animals, but they may retain the ability to tell you about how you would use or how to define different kinds of human-made artifacts, like tools and things like that. On the other hand, other people who've had damage to frontoparietal regions may lose the ability to tell you what you would do with tools, but they would retain the ability to tell you something about animals. So, for instance, if somebody who had damage to frontal parietal, which is in that dorsal stream, right? So remember, dorsal stream is where objects are and how you would use them. So one thing they may lose the ability is you say, okay, what's a hammer? And they go, I don't know. But you say, what's a pig? Oh yeah, it's pink. It's got a curly tail, rolls around in the mud. Delicious bacon. Or you say, cat. Oh yeah, fur, purrs, catches mice, all that kind of thing. So you get these really nice kind of complementary deficits if people have damage to either temporal lobe or frontal parietal. And the theory is that if you get damage to temporal lobes, that knocks out biological categories because biological entities have implicit properties, like pigs are pink, they have a certain color. Um, Cats have fur. Dogs have fur, they have a tail, it wags. These are things that are kind of like visual characteristics that define animals, that define these biological entities. On the other hand, if you get damage to frontoparietal regions, which is up near, your parietal region, which is kind of where and how you use objects, and your frontal region has your motor cortex, which actually programs the interactions with an object. If you get damage to those, you lose artifactual categories like human-made objects, because artifactual categories in entities, they have implicit uses. So it's less about how they look and more about how you use them. So there are lots of different looking can openers, but the thing they all have in common is they all open cans. And so that's what defines a can opener more than the particular visual characteristics of it. So interestingly, we've seen a kind of double dissociation of neural representations for either biological or artifactual objects in the brain, which is kind of fascinating. Okay, so this last thing that's going to happen in this lecture is I'm going to tell you about some work by Franks and Bransford, 1971. This is the same, we heard about the ants ate the jelly and all that stuff in the last lecture. That was Bransford and Franks, 1971. This one is Franks and Bransford. And again, they're interested in learning how people abstract information about kind of knowledge in the world. And so this is going to be evidence for abstraction theories of mental representations. And this is such a cool experiment. I just think it's so neat. Let me explain how it works, and hopefully you'll understand, and hopefully by the end you'll see why I think this is just such a cool study. So what Franks and Bransford did was they got a bunch of index cards, and on these index cards they drew a bunch of shapes. So first of all, they defined a base configuration. So that's this card in the upper left here. And on the left side, you have a big blue square with a small red triangle inside. And on the right, you have a big green circle with a small yellow diamond inside. And that's what they called the base configuration. And then from the base configuration, they defined a number of transformations or moves that you could do to that base configuration. And so they predefine these. And so it's stuff like delete square. So if you look at this card in the top right, it's exactly the same as the base configuration, except they deleted that blue square. Or this one below the base configuration is a major permutation. So what they did was they swapped the things from left to right, right? The whole double object, the blue square with the red triangle went to the right, and the green circle with the yellow diamond went to the left. Or another transformation could be substitute shape 1. So instead of a blue square, now you have a blue hexagon. Or you might do a minor permutation of 1. So instead of a big blue square and a small red triangle, now you have a big red triangle and a small blue square. So they just kind of flipped the sizes of those two. That's a minor permutation. You could do a minor permutation of 2. So here you notice that it used to be a big green circle and a small yellow diamond. Now it's a big yellow diamond and a small green circle. Or you could substitute shape 2. So instead of a diamond, now you've got a heart. And so on, right? Like there's all these different transformations you could do. And interestingly, you could also chain these transformations together. So for instance, in the bottom right, what we have is a major permutation. So looking at the base configuration, they moved the green circle with the yellow diamond to the left and the other one to the right. Then they did minor permutation 1. So they made it a large red triangle and a small blue square. Then they did a delete square. So they got rid of that square. So this card right here is 3 moves, major permutation, minor permutation 1, and delete square, away from the base configuration. So what they did was they took that base configuration and then they did a bunch of these different moves. Some of them were 1 move apart, a bunch of them were 2 moves apart, 3 moves apart, 4 moves apart, or 5 moves apart. And by the time you've done 5 different things, it's pretty different looking configuration. So the experiment went like this. They had a deck of cards with all these different, they had, all these different versions of the cards in there. And there were two phases to the study. In the first phase was the learning phase or the study phase. And they gave participants the deck of cards. They shuffled them for every participant, random order. And the participant had 5 minutes to look through the card deck and just try to memorize all those cards. All right. And they were told that there would be a memory test later. So they do the learning task. Then they gave them a distractor period. I think they probably made them, do a bunch of math problems or something to get them thinking about something else. Then they had a recognition period, and they showed people cards one at a time, and they asked them to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 whether they had seen that card before or not. And so here's the data. So what we have on the y-axis is the confidence rating, and it went from -5 to +5, and these are average ratings. So if you said +5, you are absolutely certain that you had seen that card in the study phase. If you said -5, you are absolutely certain you had not seen that card in the study phase. And the major thing that's really interesting here is people were most confident they had seen the base configuration, giving it a rating of about 4. If you went one move away, you got less confidence. By about 2 moves away, they were sort of 50-50 as to whether they'd seen it before. And by the time you got 3, 4, or 5 moves away, people were confident that they had not seen those cards. And, that's kind of cool data, but maybe not worthy of me gushing about this experiment. So like, what's so cool about this data? What's so cool is during the learning phase, they never included the base configuration in that deck of cards. So in other words, during the learning phase, all you saw were the delete square, major permutation, and all these other cards. The participants never saw the base configuration. But when it came time to recognize those, they were most confident that they had seen the base configuration, even though they never had. So this is super cool. This is evidence that people have kind of abstracted away. They figured out what the base category was, even though they never saw it. It's like they abstracted away the base configuration and they figured out what it looked like. And it was as if they had seen it. They hallucinated that they had seen it when they never had. So all they had seen was sort of all of the different versions of the cards around the base configuration. And that was enough for their brain to sort of catch on to what that base configuration was. And in fact, they extracted the schema of the base configuration and they misremembered having seen it, even though they never had. So to me, that's super cool. They replicate it in another study. And again, participants never saw the base configuration in the training phase, but yet they were most confident that they had seen it in the test phase. So live lecture, that is it. As a last thing, I just want to remind you that the Chapter 4 quiz is posted on Canvas. I think you have till Monday night at 11:59 p.m. to finish that. And I will be back this weekend, and we will resume class on Monday at the normal time. Hope you folks have a great weekend, and I will see you next week.